So let's start it. Humanities and storytelling. So basically, first we need to understand that humanities are social sciences. Basically, करते क्या है? What do they study? So they study about past, about knowledge, about artifacts, society, art, polity, traditions, rituals, culture, customs, religion, geography, environment, languages, human relationships, and several other things. So basically, it is revolving in and around these particular facets from a different perspectives. हर humanity अपने अलग अलग perspective से information collect करता है, study करता है, research करता है, and present करता है, right? So, how is humanity related to storytelling? So, we'll look at some important disciplines which are very closely related to the aspect of storytelling. The first is history, of course, which is basically the study of or a record of past events considered together, especially events of a particular period, country, or subject, right? So, history is basically telling you everything that has happened in your in the past और जो events हुए जो चीजें हुई वो आपको सारी information present करता है, right? But basically, what is historiography? Historiography is the study of how history has been written, right? जो भी हम history पढ़ते हैं उसकी लिखने की context के बारे में पढ़ा study करता है. In what manner was the entire history written? Was it a court history? Was it written after the events or during the events and similar and so on and so forth? Basically, when we look at history, so we can also look at historiography. Basically, how is that particular form of history written, right? Then, what are the different branches of history or various branches or different facets of which history looks at? So, there's political history, military history, social history, cultural history, world history, contemporary history, and economic history, among several others. बहुत ज़्यादा और भी है, and so on and so forth. Biographies is also something that is also a branch of history, right? So what are the different perspectives of studying history? History सिर्फ ऐसा नहीं कि record जो भी past में हुआ वो सब आपको लिख के दे दिया जाए. उसको study and जो research होता है, it is from different perspectives, of which continuity and change is one of them. What is something that has remained constant and what has continuously keeps on evolving or changing. That is the perspective through which continuity and change looks at. Then cause and effect. What would be the cause? What would be the effect? ठीक है. तो एग्जाम्पल क्या होगा? तो वर्ल्ड वॉर टू के दौरान use of atomic bombs on Japan. So because of this, that happened, so and so forth. Then evidence, particularly revolving around what the subject that we are studying, what is the amount of evidence that is available in that particular thing. तो जलियांवाला बाग हुआ तो उसका evidence क्या था? To prove that event and to explain everything, what were the evidences that were available? Then empathy based perspective भी होता है, to look at something perspective from the perspective or the feeling of empathy. Then significance, how important was that event in the history of that particular region or the country or the world, and so on and so forth. Then contestability. Contestability is basically how to the best example would be after the world war, the story or the entire episodes of the Holocaust, right? So there were a couple of factions in the entire world, one of which said the Holocaust never occurred and it was a fabrication or a story that was created, while the other would experience the entire Holocaust. They were saying that it actually had occurred. So that is an example of contestability. Eventually, it was proved that Holocaust did occur, but this is something a best example. So different perspectives से history को भी देखा जाता है. Then comes anthropology. Again, we've looked a little bit into it. It is basically the study of human race, its culture, its society, and physical development. We've also looked into the branches of anthropology: social anthropology, biological anthropology, archaeological anthropology, cultural and linguistic anthropology. So we have understanding of basically these branches as well. Then ethnography also we've looked into the study and systematic recording of human cultures, very focused on human cultures. So how does ethnography, where does the term ethnography derive from? So it derives from two Greek words meaning ethnos meaning people and graphian meaning writing. So writing about people. So ethnography, something like that. It is how it gets its name. Right? So it's very closely related to culture writing. Ethnography and culture writing are basically synonymous, but some people or some regions or some countries call it culture writing, some will call it ethnography, depending on where you are. So it is basically a field research based subject or similar to ethnography, Ethnographers basically immerse themselves in the community by observing their day-to-day lives. And participant observation is the primary tool of research in which research technique in which the investigator gains entrance into a culture, foreign culture or an alien group who is not part of by social acceptance to attain a comprehensive understanding of the internal structure. Somebody outside of a particular group gains entrance into their particular culture or the society or the clan, tries to understand them by observing them on a day-to-day lives, every day what do the different activities do, and then study it, research it, properly document it, asking proper questions based on it, and try to create an insider's perspective of what the culture is, and then present that information to the outside world. Then comes Musiology, the science or the profession of museum organization and management, while museography is defined as the practical or the applied aspect of museology. If you study museology, it is a lot of theoretical based and knowledge that you get, a lot about except the lab work that you do about restoration and preservation. You get a lot of information about how to manage a museum, exhibition के बारे में, documentation of museum, which is slightly different, very different to what documentation as we understand it. And then when you apply it or start working as a museum curator in a museum, it is basically called museography. But in India, it is basically everything is same. It all comes under museology. Museography is something that the Europeans call it, and they apply it practically. Right? Okay. So let us look at the origin of museum. Right. So after when Alexander the Great had arrived into India and he decided okay, now it is time for his retreat or he wants to go back. So during that return journey, he did not survive. He was dead by the time, and then a lot of his generals and colleagues back from where he was originally from, decided to divide the entire kingdom that Alexander the Great had captured. So Egypt fell to Ptolemy Soter the First, right? So he was one of his closest friends and his closest general. He took over the region of Egypt and he established a temple of museums, a temple of muses in Alexandria, which he called Museon. Around 3rd century, around 280 BC, this Museon was instituted by Ptolemy Soter. Museon was supposed to be an institution of learning similar to a library or university. So what did he basically do? What did Ptolemy do in the museum was he collected information, literature, artifacts from all over the world to showcase the diversity, and he intended museum to become an institution where people from all over the world can come and study here and understand the different varieties of the cultures that are there in the entire world. That was the initial concept behind museum. So what was the museum based on? The museum was based on the uh, deities called muses or the patron deities of the arts and literature and everything. So you have all the names of the different muses that are there in the Greek pantheon. And this is an image taken from Wikipedia just to give you an understanding about who the muses are. So you have muses for history, poetry, music, then tragedy, dance, lyrics, sacred poetry, astronomy, and several different other aspects as well. So he dedicated this entire institution that Ptolemy wanted to create on this basically patron deities of creative arts or something, right? So let us then look at little bit about how museums have evolved over the period of time. So from museum, it for a long period of time, a lot of the collection remained with the private individuals. Like for example, Lorenzo de' Medici during the Enlightenment phase or Renaissance period, he had a lot of people working in and around him in Florence, and Florence is the headquarters of where we get the restoration and everything from. So private collections was something that began during this particular phase. So later down the line, that evolved into a period called Cabinet of Curiosities. People who started collecting a lot of different artifacts of their choice and their according to their taste, and started creating a sort of a private collection which they used to exhibit only to the people that they wanted to. It was not open to the people. उन्हें जिनको दिखाना है वो उनको ही दिखाते कि ये हमारा collection, this is collected from that region, this is collected from that region, and so on and so forth. But the first open to public museum was the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford University around 1683. So this was something that was a part of a private collection. Then it was taken over by a person called Ashmolean. I forget his first name. So he created the first museum, and this is the first public museum that was open to the people to view. And it was the first time basically that the term museum also gets attached to the institution where people can come and see the artifacts of ancient remains and everything, right? So what about the museums in India? So there are a couple of phases that how museums developed in the country. The first was, of course, during the British colonial phase, who had the knowledge and the experience and the all the know-how of how museums should be in their own continent. So they brought that into India. Apart from that, princely states and its rulers also contributed heavily to the development of museums. They also traveled all over the world, so they brought back the experiences back to the country. Like for the example of Sayajirao Gaikwad III of Baroda, he created the Baroda Museum and Picture Gallery in his in his Baroda state, which is one of the largest state museums in the country, currently in the city of Vadodara. And it's a very unique collection. You have an Egyptian mummy over here, a giant whale over here, a lot of different collections, right? And then similarly, Maharao Kingarji of Kutch also donated his entire personal collection or private collection to developing the Kutch Museum in Bhuj. Similarly, Salarzang Museum is the collection of the Salarzang. Salarzang is basically the chief minister of the prime minister of the Nizams. So उनका जो भी collection था, that became the primary collection of the Salarzang Museum. This is just basically how princely states have contributed to the development of museums. There are a lot of private collectors and learns who private collections of the scholars and the philanthropists in the country. They also donated some of their collections or their collections to further developing museums. And then development of ASI or the emergence of ASI after Alexander Cunningham established ASI, a lot of the excavations and the artifacts collected in that particular phase were also displayed or presented through museums, right? Similarly, Royal Asiatic Society and William Jones and the work of John Marshall, we're all aware about it. All those artifacts and everything helped the development of museums in the country. So what are the different types of museums? We'll spend a little time on it. So we have the first and foremost, we need to understand that we have 3-4 different major groups. The first is the government museums and the state museums and the private museums. Very simply put, उन तीनों के बीच में सारे divide होते हैं, but thematic museums basically. So the first is the multidisciplinary museum. Different subjects put under one roof. So example, National Museum would be an example of that. Even Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya would be an example of that. Then what would be the example of state museum? So Baroda Museum and Picture Gallery. It is the state museum of the state of Gujarat, right? So art museum would be Sanskriti Museum in New Delhi. Modern art museum would be National Gallery of Modern Art. Folk museum कौन सा हो सकता था? भारतीय लोक कला मंडल of Udaipur, which displays the folk culture and diversity of the entire state of Rajasthan. Then indigenous museum क्या हो सकता है? तो मानव संग्रहालय of Bhopal, showcasing the indigenous culture and heritage of the entire country at Bhopal, right? What is the concept of museum with no walls? It's an open air museum. Museum usually has walls on all the sides, while certain museums showcase their collections without any walls. So Vacha Museum Tejgarh of the Adivasi Academy, says itself उसका एक तरफ का पूरा wall it's in a courtyard के बीच में बनाया गया. I'll show you certain pictures down the line. Crafts Museum, so handicraft, National Handicraft and Handloom Museum, History Museum like the Dalpat Rai, LD Museum of Ahmedabad, Archaeology Museum like the Mathura Museum, जो भी वहाँ पे Mathura has been a lot of archaeological excavations have been taken in and around the region of Mathura. So when you visit the Mathura Museum, it's entirely showcasing the archaeological excavated artifacts. Then Memorial Museum would be Cellular Jail of Port Blair. वो हो सकता है. रॉयल कलेक्शन के बहुत सारे म्यूजियम्स है, जैसे फतेह सिंह म्यूजियम, महाराजा फतेह सिंह म्यूजियम ऑफ बड़ौदा, विच इज स्टिल अंडर द गायकवाड़ रॉयल फैमिली ऑफ बड़ौदा. Then defense museum, science museum, sports, we have many thematic museums. So different thematics, different heritage to showcase. Then basically, how do they or these humanities present their information? Let us look at a little bit about that. So history presents you information on specifically human past and the events of the human past. Archaeology gives you information about the remains of the human past. जो भी excavation में artifacts मिलते, they are researched and presented in form of you through various mediums, right? Anthropology will tell you information about the development of human civilization. How did Africa develop? How did Asia develop? How did America develop? How did the different communities develop? All that information. Ethnography gives you information on development or evolution of the human culture. Geography, similarly, nature and its development. Art will give you development of arts, of how different forms of art have developed. Sculptures कैसे develop हुए, murals कैसे develop हुए, cave painting का क्या था, all that sort of information. And linguistics will tell you about how languages have developed. What is language impact? What is different? Why do language keep on changing? Why do we have different types of grammars? Why do we have similar words in different languages? All that information. Similarly, literature gives you information on literature, political science, and so forth. So different parameters, different humanities telling you something or the other in a very specific manner. But what is the one common factor in it? All of them are giving you information about the humanity, right? So basically what is it all about? अगर हमें बहुत simple terms में अगर humanities या तो social sciences को देखना है तो they are all telling you stories of all things humanity through systematic scientific study के साथ scientifically study करके research करके careful इसके analysis करके they are just telling you stories, right? It's all revolving around stories. So when we are talking about stories, let us look at a little bit about logos and mythos. Now, if you do not know about logos and mythos, we'll look into that. But before that, let us spend little time on what is logy and graphy. हम हमारे subjects के पीछे हमेशा logy and graphy देखते हैं, but what is the meaning of it, right? तो वो थोड़ा देख म्यूजोलॉजी, जियोग्राफी ये सब हम देखते तो हैं, पर उसके मीनिंग थोड़े देख लेते हैं, ठीक है? So logy is basically the scientific study of a particular subject or a branch of knowledge, while graphy is the method of writing about that subject or a branch of knowledge. That is a very simple basic difference between the two, which I hope you guys can understand a little bit. So when we are talking about logos, we have to go back to the first one. The logos and mythos kahan se aaya? So in the ancient Greek phase, the two words come from us to in ancient Greek language से हमारे पास आते हैं. Logos basically means about collecting information and knowledge through the logical reasoning, systematic scientific methods से, while mythos is something that fancies the story and the Greek heritage in the Greek mythology and everything. But in ancient Greek, there was not much difference between the two. They considered both of them on an equal platform. Logos was equally important, while mythos was also equally important. Based on the mythos and their ancestry and their heritage, or based on the stories that they had, they used to develop further stories and scientifically study the around everything that was around them. So when we are talking about logos of humanities, we are basically talking about that each social science in their own respective way studies and presents a logical, rational, analytical perspective of humanity, right? And each branch is presenting a story in terms of its parts. It might be society ki information, culture ki information, heritage ki information. It can be in form of a in medium of literature, artifacts, and so on and so forth. But in the Indian context, there are several major universities जो हमारे वहाँ भी डिस्कस के हमारे वहाँ हिस्ट्री अवेलेबल है, म्यूजोलॉजी अवेलेबल है, एंथ्रोपोलॉजी भी थोड़ा थोड़ा अभी अवेलेबल है, बट एथनोग्राफी इज स्टिल नॉट अवेलेबल. सो ह्यूमैनिटीज के बारे में अगर हम बात करते हैं, वी आर सच अ डाइवर्सिटी एंड डाइवर्स कल्चर ऑफ दिस एंटायर थिंग, एथनोग्राफी शुड आल्सो बी अवेलेबल टू अस. आई होप दैट हैपेंस वेरी सून. ओके. So, whereas, what about the mythos? What about the different aspects of the oral and intangible heritage? तो उसके बारे में देखेंगे तो थोड़ा epics को समझते हैं. What about the epics? तो थोड़ा उनको समझते हैं. तो let us look at the tradition of Indian epics. There are two different forms of epics that are available to us in the country. The first is the Sastry Literature, which is found specifically in the Sanskrit language, which talks to us about different types of gods, kings, sages, universe, and cosmos, and different subjects. Shastri literature के जो authors and poets है, they are known to us and we find them in written format like Valmiki की रामायण. We know कि उनके author कौन है. It is available to us in a written format. While that the other is the Lokika literature, which is available to us in Prakrit language. Now Sanskrit was the language of the elite, while the commoners की language जो थी वो प्राकृत थी. प्राकृतिक लैंग्वेज लिटरेचर जो है उनके एपिक्स जो है वो भी गॉड्स ह्यूमंस लोकल यूनिवर्स ये सब चीजों की बात करें. लोकल डज व्हाट डज द लोकल वर्ड मीन हियर? रीजनल हीरोज के बारे में, डिफरेंट गॉड्स के बारे में, लोकल रीजनल की हिस्ट्री के बारे में, ऐसे सब चीजें उसमें हम ज्यादातर पाते हैं. और लौकिक लिटरेचर के authors and poets are not known. It is a community-based sharing and transmission. It is not owned or created by one particular individual. It is the entire community and that has been believing in it and transmitting it for a long period of time. Yeah, okay. Sorry. So basically, Shastri literature, we find it in written format, while Lokik literature is found mostly in form of oral literature. That is the entire thing. These are the two basic traditions that we have seen in the Indian epics. But we also need to understand that there is in Indian literature, we also have an endless loop or a cyclic, time cyclic पूरा एक सिनेरियो है जो एपिक्स में एंड अलग स्टोरीज में ओरल लिटरेचर में एंड लिटरेचर में इंडिया के दिखता है. For thousands and thousands of years, this has been going on. It starts with oral, then goes to the written format, again goes back to the oral form, again comes back to the written form. So it keeps on evolving in that particular manner. It is a never-ending, endless circle and endless not जैसा है ओके खत्म ही नहीं होगा. It keeps on revolving between these two, oral से written, written से oral, so on and so forth. It keeps on doing with that. Let us look at some classification of Indian epics. So we have two different types of epics, जिसमें दो types के stories हमारे पास आते हैं. The Puranas जो हम कहते हैं, they are basically myths and legends which have various thematics distributed among various thematics. It can be about cosmos, it can be about mineralogy, astronomy, geology, court के रॉयल कोर्ट्स के बारे में भी हो सकते हैं. It can be about gods, it can be about regional heroes, community heroes, different things. Right? On the other hand, it's itihasa. Itihasa literally means thus so happened or so it happened. And under the itihasa comes the Ramayana and Mahabharata. But a lot of factors affect these stories or these Puranas and Itihasa, which can be local, culture, tradition, customs, imagination, because it revolves again, goes back to oral and written का जो impact इन पे होता है, the stories evolve. It can be regional, local thing that the elements can come. Culture के elements आ सकते हैं, tradition के elements can impact them, customs can, imagination, of course, who is telling that story, how is it telling that story, how is it the story presented, so on and so forth. And basically, what is the result of all these factors? This is how we basically get versions of myths, legends, and epics. Like according to A.K. Ramanujan, he says there are over 300 versions of Ramayana and Mahabharata, right? So I hope you all know about Ramayana and Mahabharata, but I'll tell you little stories about the different varieties of Ramayana and Mahabharata that I have read little bit about, right? The first is कि we know कि रामायण का eventual ending क्या है. Ram defeats and kills Ravana himself, then he brings back uh, Sita with him, and then all the other episodes happen. So we have different variations and different versions of those endings. One of them tells us that Sita was actually the daughter of Ravan, and he did not want his daughter to get troubled in the during when she was traveling with Ram and Lakshman in the forest. He did not want her to have those atrocities and everything. The difficulty ना आए उसकी लाइफ में, इसलिए उनको वहां से वो अपने किंगडम लेकर आते हैं, which eventually leads to the entire war between them. Right? The other story tells us कि एक पीरियड ऐसा था कि जब वो ब्रिज बना रहे थे टू गो टू लंका, द ब्रिज द टाइम was लग रहा था ब्रिज बनाने के लिए, was taking such a long time that Lakshman was getting agitated because he was considered to be a very hot-headed and very angry individual. तो उन्होंने क्या किया कि उन्होंने छोटी एक आर्मी अपनी छोटे कुछ एक बटालियन को लेके ही वेंट टू लंका. ही डिफीटेड एवरीबॉडी इन लंका इंक्लूडिंग किलिंग रावण. ही ब्रिंग्स सीता बैक टू Ram after that. He defeats everybody. But then Ram feels that as an insult to his ego and his challenge that he could not himself rescue his own wife and his brother had to do that. So he sentences Ram to Lakshman to death and he is beheaded. तो एक different ending हमारे सामने ऐसा आता है. There are different versions of like that. Even the indigenous communities find different roles to play in this particular entire epics that we have. Like the Rabari community has a very specific role to play in the Mahabharata story, of which I'll tell you a little story down the line. But there are different versions, different in telling these particular stories that we know of. Yeah, just a minute, sorry. Okay. So epics come to us in various types, of which there are found in the oral oral फॉर्म में मिलते हैं, written फॉर्म में, परफॉर्मेटिव टाइम फॉर्म में जिसमें डांस एंड म्यूजिक भी जुड़ जाता है, विजुअल फॉर्म में मिलते हैं जिसमें आर्ट फॉर्म जुड़ जाता है, जिसमें स्क्रोल पेंटिंग के साथ. Then we can also see epics through the performance of various rituals एंड आर्किटेक्चर. टेम्पल आर्किटेक्चर भी बहुत सारे एपिक्स के माध्यम से उन्हें एपिक्स को पढ़ सकते हैं. ओरल एपिक्स बहुत सारे वेरियस टाइप के हमारे वहाँ होते हैं. गोंडवानी वगैरह के बारे में अगर आप नहीं जानते तो थोड़ा आप, the entire epic of the Gond people, that is basically an oral heritage that has still survived over a long period of time. रिटर्न में हम रामायण महाभारत के बारे में देख सकते हैं. परफॉर्मेटिव क्या क्या देख सकते हैं तो बाबू जी का पढ़ का जो पूरा ट्रेडिशन है राजस्थान में, इट इन्वॉल्व्स वेराइटी ऑफ डिफरेंट आर्ट फॉर्म्स और डिफरेंट वर्जन्स. उसमें स्क्रोल पेंटिंग भी जुड़ता है, उसमें म्यूजिक भी जुड़ता है, उसमें म्यूजिकल इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स भी है, देयर इज डांस इन इट, देयर इज ट्रेडिशन ऑफ बार्डिक बार्ड्स भी उसमें इंक्लूड होते हैं. It is a complete performance through which the epic is told or found or can be studied, right? Visual इसमें scroll paintings में again बाबू जी का पढ़ के अंदर बहुत बड़ी एक scroll painting का ट्रेडिशन होता है, जिसके बारे में भी हम आगे देखेंगे. रिचुअल के फॉर्म में कैसे देख सकते हैं तो जो बाबू पितरों का ट्रेडिशन है ऑफ द राठवा कम्युनिटी, वो इज द एंटायर स्टोरी ऑफ द एपिक ऑफ बाबू पितरो. How Babu Pitoro gets is born, who are his parents, how does he become the king of the gods of the Rathwa pantheon, then what does he do, how does he become the person who helps and eradicates problems for the Rathwas, how do the Rathwas worship him, और पूरा एक रिचुअल के फॉर्म में हम उसको देख सकते हैं. ठीक है. Then why are myths so important for us to study or to consider properly and understand them properly? Because they are very closely associated with identity, right? Most stories are associated with identity, and most communities in India have an origin story or a story of their supreme god, of their first father or mother. Like, let me tell you a story now so that you do not get bored a lot. गोंड कम्युनिटी की एक ओरिजिन स्टोरी है, स्टोरी अबाउट हाउ द मदर अर्थ वाज क्रिएटेड. So according to them, their chief god is called बड़ा देव. बड़ा देव is basically भगवान शिव के ही एक अवतार है. डिफरेंट persona, different personality दिखती है उनकी, portraits quite differently, but बड़ा देव is the main god of the Gond people. So one day बड़ा देव is walking around and he decides कि मुझे अर्थ क्रिएट करनी है. But there is no dirt available, no soil available anywhere in the world. So he creates a crow. That first crow is white in color. और वो crow को वो टास्क देते हैं बड़ा देव के जाओ और मिट्टी ढूंढो, धरती के बनाने के लिए मिट्टी ढूंढ के लाइए मेरी. तो कौवा जाता है, बहुत दूर दूर तक उड़ता है, पर उसे कुछ नहीं दिखता, मिट्टी नहीं दिखती, सब जगह पानी ही पानी दिखता है, उसको मिट्टी कहीं नहीं मिलती. फिर वो बहुत थक जाता है, उसको दूर शेषनाग बैठे हुए दिखते हैं, तो सोचता है कि चलो थोड़ा सा रेस्ट कर ले इनके पास. तो जैसे वो उनके पास जाके बैठता है, शेषनाग जी की नींद उड़ जाती है, नींद हराम कर देता है वो, और गुस्से में शेषनाग जी उस पर हिस कर देते हैं. तो उनकी ब्रेथ में भी इतना पॉइजन होता है कि कौवा व्हाइट से ब्लैक बन जाता है. तो दैट इज वाई क्रोज आर स्टिल ब्लैक इन कलर. तो फिर कौवा बेचारा डर के वापिस उड़ जाता है, वहां से शेषनाग जी को सॉरी बोल के उड़ जाता है, और फिर भी मिट्टी ढूंढने के लिए उड़ता रहता है. बहुत थक जाता है, फिर वापस बड़ा देव जी के पास आता है कि मुझे कहीं नहीं मिली मिट्टी, मैं क्या करूं. तो बड़ा देव जी कहते हैं अब दूसरे डायरेक्शन में जाओ. तो दूसरे डायरेक्शन में जाके वो उड़ता है उड़ता है उड़ता है, और बहुत दूर उसे एक गुफा दिखती है. तो वो सोचता है चलो इस गुफा में कोशिश करते, शायद यहाँ पे मिल जाए. बट वो जैसे गुफा में एंटर करता है, उसके ऊपर बहुत बड़ी परछाई आती है, और ऊपर दिखता है तो बकासुर उसके सामने खड़ा होता है. और बकासुर उससे बोलता है कि पहले मुझे बता तू यहाँ पे क्यों आया है, नहीं तो मैं तुझे खा जाऊंगा. तो बकासुर उसको बताता है कि बड़ा देव ने मुझे भेजा है मिट्टी ढूंढने के लिए, जिनकी वजह से वो धरती बनानी है उनको। तो बकासुर कहता है मेरी एक शर्त है, वो पूरी हो जाएगी तो मैं मिट्टी दे दूंगा और उससे बड़ा देव जी ये धरती बना देंगे। तो वो पूछता है क्या शर्त है, कि जिस मिट्टी से पूरी धरती बनेगी पूरी की पूरी, वो मेरी प्रॉपर्टी होगी। तो बड़ा देव की अपना कौवा जाता है बड़ा देव जी के पास और उसको ये शर्त बताता है बकासुर की। और ये कहते हैं, बड़ा देव कहते हैं ठीक है मुझे मंजूर है, देख लेंगे बाद में, आप मिट्टी लेकर आइए। फिर कौवा जाता है बकासुर के पास, उनको कहता है कि बड़ा देव जी मान गए और अब मुझे मिट्टी दीजिए जिससे धरती बन सकती है। तो मिट्टी लेके कौवा वापस बड़ा देव जी के पास आता है और उससे धरती बनती है। और धरती की देखभाल रखने के लिए कोई तो चाहिए, इसलिए वो बड़ा देव जी सोचते हैं कि चलो इंसान को बनाते हैं। और वो मूला गोंदनी नाम की एक लेडी को जन्म देते हैं। और मूला गोंदनी पहली गोंड की फर्स्ट, शी इज द बेसिकली द फर्स्ट मदर ऑफ द गोंड कम्युनिटी। And there is a lot of different additions later on, but just to give an idea कि how different stories we can understand कि basically क्या क्या। there's also involvement of various communities के धीरे धीरे कैसे कैसे अलग अलग communities को जन्म दिया गया to maintain and protect, to provide knowledge, to provide different skills. It's a very lengthy story. So this is basically about stories and why the stories should be considered a part of a knowledge branch rather than considering them just as myths or something. Then moving on, in some instances, the protagonist is portrayed as a cultural or cult hero to humanize the divine character. Indigenous culture and heritage की जब epics and stories and myths हम देखते हैं, eventually the main hero or the protagonist is usually looked or portrayed as a very humanized figure, so that it provides them as a moral or inspiration कि ये भी अगर कर सकते तो हम भी कर सकते हैं, वो भी इंसान था हम भी इंसान है, वो is not portrayed larger than life or something, right? Then creation myths, like just the story like we heard right now, form a foundation of identity for many communities, right? तो धरती माँ कैसे बनी, धरती माँ की वजह बनने के बाद पहली हमारी समाज की माता कैसे जन्म हुई, वो समाज की माता ने क्या क्या किया, धरती का रखवाला धरती का देख रेख कैसे की, तो शी protected all the mother earth, उनके एनिमल एंड नेचुरल वर्ल्ड को उन्होंने प्रोटेक्ट कैसे किया, हाउ डिड शी मेंटेन एवरीथिंग, हाउ डिड द गोंड पीपल देन slowly start to get created. So these are very important stories because they basically are revolving around the community of not just one individual but entire societies that are believing that stories. And similarly, myths, epics, hero epics are connected to traditions which connect further to rituals, festivals, etc., which are further connected to a shared memory of the past. All of the stories that we are discussing or that we will discuss in the coming sessions as well are further somewhere or the other connected to certain types of rituals. कुछ customs के साथ है, कुछ festival के साथ जुड़े, कुछ agriculture के साथ जुड़े, different activities के साथ जुड़ी हुई stories है, जो एक collective memory का part है, एक common world view, एक society, एक culture, एक community जो follow करती है. So this is why it is certainly very important that we pay a specific amount of attention to these stories that we encounter. Then of course past plays an important part in the present, which creates an aspiration of future. जो हम past में जो हमको stories मिली है उनके impact आज भी हम देखते हैं और उनका वजह से future भी depend बहुत a lot of events of the future are dependent on what we do today based on what you've learned yesterday. Similarly, so Indian mythos, how it is available to us. So variety of epics are there. We have the Purana, Jataka tales, Vedic literature, different Veds, and Panchatantra. There's a wide variety and wide range of oral history, like the story we just heard. There are several other stories like that. Indigenous knowledge ki stories have not even started there to tell you about that. This is basically all about how Indian mythos is available to us. But there is an absence of Indian mythos. So now let me ask you an interactive question. थोड़ा again आपका participation करते हैं. How much do you know about Rama and Mahabharata, Puranas, Jatakas, Panchatantra? What is your knowledge about them? How did you come to know about them? रामानंद सागर से पता चला, बी आर चोपड़ा से पता चला, अमर चित्रकथा से पता चला, ग्रैंड पेरेंट्स से पता चला, किससे पता चला? या एनी थॉट्स ऑन इट?
Animated movies, childhood.
या एनिमेटेड मूवीज,
Chitrakartha.
अमर चित्रकथा, यस,
So
व्हाट
even
एल्स?
that uh, Ramayan series which used to be lockdown में भी था. And
हम्म, यस, व्हाट एल्स? व्हाट आर द अदर सोर्सेज दैट यू फाउंड अबाउट दिस स्टोरीज? आपको ये सब चीजें कैसे पता चली?
so
श्रीमद् भगवद
also through parents and grandparents because when I was small, I was very curious to know about the reasons behind the festivals we used to celebrate or rituals that were done. So, उधर से राम रामायण and stuff का पता चला.
ओके, व्हाट एल्स?
So my grandmother used to read me the books of Mahabharata and Ramayana. I still have it.
या, ओके,
And Bhagavad
ग्रेट.
Gita also.
Yeah, Bhagavad Gita. Yeah. Similarly, my experience was very similar as well. रामायण महाभारत तो हमें सीरियल्स नहीं देखे, बट माई एंट्री इनटू द मिथोलॉजी और जो बुक्स अवेलेबल होते हैं हमारे घर में, दैट वाज बिकॉज ऑफ माय मदर. माय मदर इज अ वेरी वेरी क्या कहेंगे, अंधविश्वासी टाइप की लेडी है. शी बिलीव्स इन बाबाज एंड ऑल दोस के मुझे जो भी प्रॉब्लम है वो हमारी वजह से नहीं है, इट इज बिकॉज ऑफ सुपर नेचुरल एलिमेंट्स लाइक दैट. So I used to get a lot of I used to get disturbed because of all these activities and everything. So there was this शिव पुराण हमारे घर में पड़ी थी, तो just to have an argument and learn about what is she talking about, I picked up the शिव पुराण, and that was my first entry into mythology of India that we had. So yeah, this is basically the source that we have right now. We do not have it in, there's no room basically for all this culture and that the information and the knowledge that is there in Rama and Mahabharata and all this in the education system that is there in the country. Culture studies is still not part of our academic framework. We are not taught about Rama and Mahabharata, we just know. And there's a big difference between learning and knowing. Knowing is just कि हाँ आपने थर्ड पर्सन से सुना होगा, इसमें कुछ देखा होगा, उसमें कुछ देख पढ़ा होगा. That's it. We are not taught about it. Like we are taught about the entire history of Maratha kingdom and the Mughal empire and the slave dynasties, और इल्तुतमिश के बारे में पढ़ते हैं, खिलजी के बारे में पढ़ते हैं, कनिष्क के बारे में पढ़ते हैं, अशोक के बारे में पढ़ते हैं. We learn about all sorts of things in history and everything, but nothing about these particular aspects. So this is just about that we know about these things. We are not taught or we do not learn all these things. So what about the knowledge of indigenous myths and epics? Now another interactive question. Look at this particular epics that I've listed down. Epic of Babuji, Bhiloka Bharat, Epic of Baba Pithora, Epic of Bhartari, Gondwani. Anybody of you has heard about it? कभी सुना है, पढ़ा है, कुछ जानते हो? उसके अलावा भी कुछ जानते हो तो भी शेयर कर सकते हैं. It is exactly the point that I was trying to showcase in front of you. We all know little bit about रामायण महाभारत के बारे में जानते हैं, जातका टेल्स में क्या होता है वो थोड़ा जानते हैं, ऋग्वेद के बारे में जानते हैं, सामवेद यजुर्वेद उनके बारे में जानते हैं. एटलीस्ट वी हैव लिटिल बिट ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन थ्रू द सीरियल्स एंड द रामायण सागर बी आर चोपड़ा के माध्यम से कुछ हम सीखते हैं. अमर चित्रकथा में बहुत कुछ सिखाता है. When we are talking about this particular epics which are considered or followed by millions and millions of people all across the country, we have very little information about them. So पाबू जी का जो पूरा एपिक है, इट इज कॉल्ड प्रभु प्रकाश. उसमें बहुत सारे इंटरेस्टिंग इवेंट्स है. जस्ट टू टेल यू लिटिल बिट अबाउट इट, विल टॉक अबाउट इट लिटिल बिट. उनमें भी पाबू जी इज बेसिकली अ कल्ट हीरो और कम्युनिटी हीरो जो गौ सेवा और एनिमल प्रोटेक्शन के लिए बहुत जाने माने होते हैं. उनकी जो रीजन होती है, जो किंगडम होता है, उनके बड़े भाई उसे रूल करते हैं. देयर इज कॉन्स्टेंटली फाइट गोइंग ऑन इन एंड अराउंड दैट रीजन. So he's also a very good warrior that he protects his kingdom continuously and the animals that are there in the entire kingdom that is belongs to. उसमें एक इंटरेस्टिंग एपिसोड ये भी है कि he wants to give उनकी नीस की शादी होती है उनके बेस्ट फ्रेंड के साथ, and he wants to give them the best gift possible over there. So वो एक लंका जाके एक एक्सपीडिशन करते हैं, एक छोटी सी आर्मी बना के वो लंका जाते हैं, लंका के राजा रावण को डिफीट करते, ही ब्रिंग्स अ वेरी स्पेशल गिफ्ट, जिसकी स्टोरी मैं बाद में आपको बताऊंगा। तो बाबू जी का पूरा जो हिस्ट्री है, वॉट एवर हिज अचीवमेंट्स एंड हिज फेलियर्स वर, पूरा का पूरा इज अवेलेबल टू अस। भीलों का भारत इज बेसिकली हाउ भील कम्युनिटी लुक्स एट द development of Bharat. It's a very, very interesting story. I have a couple of books that I'll share with you. Then बाबा पिथोरा का जो पूरा एपिक है, इट्स अ वेरी एंटायर थिंग, आई विल नॉट शेयर लॉट ऑफ इट, थोड़ा बहुत ऑलरेडी मैंने कह दिया है, बट हम जब पिथोरा के बारे में बात करेंगे तो मैं ज़्यादा इंफॉर्मेशन दूंगा। सिमिलरली भारतरी इज अ वेरी वेरी ओरल बेस्ड, ओरल लिटरेचर, ओरल हेरिटेज है पूरा, जो छत्तीसगढ़ के राजा भरतरी पे बेस्ड है। गोंडवानी इज द एंटायर एपिक टेल ऑफ द गोंड, जिसमें से एक छोटी सी स्टोरी आपने ऑलरेडी सुन ली है। सो द if you look at the unexplored mythos of the indigenous India, we can have such a lot of more information of the country diversity के बारे में जब हम constantly बात करते हैं। तो let's take an example, अगर हमारे कंट्री में 800 इंडिजिनस कम्युनिटीज है, सबका एक एपिक है, सबका एक आर्ट फॉर्म है, सबका एक डांस फॉर्म है, सबके पास एक टाइप का म्यूजिक है, so the amount of diversity in the entire country क्या हो सकती है, you can just imagine, right? So 104 million people, 8.6 population, second largest indigenous population. We still do not know much about the entire country, even if we have several books available to us, we have the knowledge about it, but awareness and the knowledge is still unexplored. So this is just to explain to you कि कितना सारा और रिसर्च करने के लिए अभी भी अपने पास बाकी है. Just because we've done a lot of work in different disciplines does not mean the entire thing is done. We still have some uncharted areas in the country. So, what is interpreting indigeneity again? What is the entire concept behind our entire workshop? That is, here each of our indigenous community has a vast system of knowledge, culture, heritage, and a worldview, which is apart from a niche audience still remains unread, unseen, and unheard. And basically, their story is still untold, and it is basically our task, our duty, that we tell or collect all these stories and explain everybody the entire story क्या है. So why am I talking about logos and mythos and logos? So for me, when we just look at the logos or just study or focus on the logos aspect of it, what does logos require to collect all the information? We have to remain detached. We do not have to be biased about anything. We need to have a purpose behind collecting that information. It has to require facts. It requires proof, right? While on the other hand, mythos is totally based on empathy. You need to have faith in it, you need to experience it, and it is totally abstract. But if you only present the logos, it is just 50% of the story. And but if on the other hand, if you just focus on the mythos, it is again only 50% of the story. When you combine both logos and mythos together, then it can give you the pure identity. Each on its own is just a fragmentation of reality and truth. दोनों को जोड़ेंगे तभी आपको पूरी स्टोरी पता चलेगी, दोनों को नहीं जोड़ेंगे आपको सिर्फ 50% दिखेगा. इट इज वेरी सिमिलर टू आर्ट एज वेल. आर्ट सिर्फ जो आप देखते हैं वही देखोगे, उसके पीछे का आपको स्टोरी नहीं पता चलेगा. यू नीड टू सी, you need to go beyond what your eyes see, right? Okay, so here's another interesting development that we've been seeing in the recent times: mythopia. Now, mythopia is basically the art of creating myth, which was the famous, most famous is J.R.R. Tolkien. I hope you guys know about Tolkien. अगर नहीं पता है तो you really are very far behind in your reading. Then Indian mythology is also, we've looked into that, ranges far further than just Ramayana and Mahabharata, but we keep on retelling those and those stories itself. There is still a lot of information and epics and a lot of stories available to us, which through mythopia or the genre of mythopia, which is a very growing genre in the current form or the current period, we can use this particular format to present those stories as well. So here's a very interesting and good quote by one of my favorite authors, Dr. Devdutt Patnaik. So what does he say? Okay, fact is everybody's truth. Fiction is nobody's truth. While myth, it is somebody's truth. It is a cultural truth. It might be a religious truth, nation's truth, one that binds the community together by giving them a common worldview to function within. Basically, what is fact, what is fiction, what is myth is what is talking about. So we are talking about myths for a long time. So there are several different types of myth, which I'm just sharing a couple of them with you. The first is the etiological myth, which basically explains why and how or something is there. So basically origin stories इस category में आएंगी. तो हमने मूला गोडनी की जो story सुनी तो पूरी की पूरी is explaining why and how of something was happening. Why did Mother Earth got created? How it got created? तो पूरी ऐसी stories जो हमने सुनी वो etiological myth के अंदर आएगी. Then would be historical myth, which is basically refers to hyperbolic retelling of an event in the past. तो जिसमें हम हनुमान जी को रख सकते हैं कि हनुमान जी पहाड़ जितने बड़े हो सकते थे, चींटी जितने छोटे हो सकते थे, वह सुपर ह्यूमन, ही कुड फ्लाई, ही कुड लिफ्ट माउंटेन्स एंड ब्रेक फ्रॉम वास्ट डिस्टेंसेस. तो ये पूरा का पूरा historically it might be something different, but it because people have been telling that story and kept on adding to that story, and they might be big fans of the character of Hanuman or the person Hanuman or the individual Hanuman, and they kept on adding different elements to it, making it a hyperbolic retelling. Then cognitive myths basically explain exploratory quest between from the known to the unknown. So kinship कैसे develop हुआ, language कैसे develop हुई, festivals कैसे develop हुई, all the stories and myths come under cognitive myths. So basically what information and how it is perceived by the human mind or human brain. It is what is the focus of cognitive myths. So this is another very important quote. I have forgotten who is the author. If possible, can you guys can identify it? So within the realm of uncertainty lie myths and stories, never entirely believed but never entirely doubted. The explorer searches for their origins to answer the question who we are. So eventually, at the end, आप अगर ह्यूमैनिटीज के हो कि साइंसेस के हो कि प्योर साइंसेस के हो कि किसी भी फील्ड के स्टूडेंट हो कि एक प्रोफेशनल हो, इवेंचुअली यू आर ऑल डूइंग द सेम थिंग कि हु वी आर. हिस्ट्री भी आपको वही करने की कोशिश कर रहा है एंड फिजिक्स भी आपको वही करने की कोशिश कर रहा है. फिजिक्स माइट बी कॉन्सेंट्रेटिंग ऑन हाउ डिड वी कम इनटू दिस वर्ल्ड और व्हाट इज द ओरिजिन ऑफ द एंटायर कॉस्मोस. History is basically trying to tell you the story ke what happened in the past and do not repeat certain things or keep on repeating certain things. Similarly, every discipline is doing the same thing, evolving, or eventually they are trying to figure out the same question, who we are and why are we there in this particular world. So which are some of the oldest stories in the world? Epic of Gilgamesh. Epic of Gilgamesh अगर आपने नहीं पढ़ी है तो please do read it. देन होमर की इलियाद एंड ओडिसी भी पढ़िए. दिस इज स्टिल अवेलेबल इन वजे कॉलेज. मैंने भी यहीं होमर के बुक्स वहीं पढ़े थे. इंडियन एपिक्स अगर आपने नहीं पढ़े हैं, रामानंद सागर और बी आर चोपड़ा से थोड़ा आगे जाइए, उनके बारे में थोड़ा और पढ़िए, ऋग्वेद को पढ़िए. So just to understand the world around you, these are the older stories, something that you guys should always know about, always have little information about them. There are several other things I have not mentioned over here. These are just some of my favorites, so that's why I've written over here. Okay, so now here's another thing that you guys need to concentrate on. So now can you say, is India the land of unity in diversity or is it the land of infinite stories? अगर 800 communities की 800 stories हमारे पास है, 800 epics. Epics are basically coming together of several million different stories. तो अगर हमारे पास 800 communities की stories है, तो is it the land of infinite stories? What do you guys think?